Okay. Good morning to all in the US and a very good evening to everyone in Asia. My name is Craig Allen, and I am president of the US China Business Council. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our book discussion series. We look forward to bringing you timely discussions with authors who are contributing thoughtful analysis, and in this particular case, also practical recommendations regarding the US-China bilateral relationship. So thank you again for joining this discussion with Steve Roach, author of an excellent new book, Accidental Conflict, America, China, and the Clash of False Narratives. And I'm going to show you my copy right there. Strongly recommend this book to all listeners. And I'm grateful to Steve for accepting my invitation to meet with USCBC members and friends for a discussion on his scholarship. Today's discussion is primarily for members and friends of the US-China Business Council, but it will be broadcast on YouTube. And so we would like to welcome your questions and your comments. But as this video will be made public, we ask that you put your questions into the Q&A function, and I will bring them up with the author, as many as possible. So I suspect that everyone in this audience knows Steve Roach. However, let me note that he is a senior fellow at the Paul Tsai China Center of the Yale Law School, and he is the former chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia. He is the author of another excellent book, Unbalanced: The Codependency Between America and China. And Steve, I've read all of your work, and I'm here to say that your most current work is among the best, and I would recommend it to anyone with an interest in the US-China relationship. I hope it's read broadly, both in the United States and in China. In my view, this book complements other recent work by Scott Rozelle of Stanford, Michael Pettis of Beijing University, but this book is different. I found the book to be an effective amalgamation of game theory, geopolitical analysis, and macroeconomics, and you make a compelling case for a reset in the Chinese economy and in the bilateral relationship. So for me, this book is original, refreshing, insightful. There's nothing cliche about it. It's not the normal Washington or New York centric view of the world. It is not predictable. It is entirely original. In short, a fantastic piece of new original research and thoughtful reflection on the most difficult questions in the contemporary era, the dysfunctionality of the US-China relationship. So Steve, let me turn it over to you for an introduction of the book, and then we'll welcome members' questions. And I have a couple up my sleeve too that I'd be delighted to get your guidance on. So Steve, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Craig, for your kind words and for opening up the US-China Business Council platform for me to talk about this new book of mine. So I want to just make a few points in the overview and then get immediately into the Q&A. I want to just start with the point that you alluded to in your introduction, but I'll push it a little bit further. Contrary to what is conventional wisdom, certainly in Washington, but really around the country right now, America does not have a China problem. And contrary to what you hear in Asia, and I was out there a month ago, and I'm actually headed back to Beijing next month, China does not have an America problem. The two nations together have a relationship problem. And so I spend the first three chapters of the book talking about the timeline of this relationship problem, which began very innocently in the late 70s and early 80s with a comfortable marriage of convenience, where the ties then deepened and China depended much more heavily on the United States, especially after the WTO accession, as a source, major source, is largest source for a long time of external demand, driving this incredibly powerful export-led growth model. The U.S., conversely to the view that many hold in Washington, was equally dependent on China. American consumers needed low-cost goods to make ends meet. We needed Chinese demand for treasuries to fund our budget deficits. And believe it or not, we needed China to support external demand for our own exports. China has quietly emerged as America's third largest and most rapidly growing export market. So the marriage of convenience morphed into a deeper interdependency that I dubbed in my previous book codependency. But I warned at the end of that book that codependency is inherently unstable. If one partner changes the rules of engagement, the other one tends to lash out, and that creates friction and ultimately conflict. And we are now in the conflict phase of codependency. And in the last 5 years, we've gone from a trade war to a tech war to now the early stages of what I and others would dub a new Cold War. And so the pace of conflict escalation is accelerating. And in just the last couple of weeks, if we don't need any more evidence of that, we've seen the balloon, we've seen pressures bearing down acutely on Taiwan again, and we've seen in the last couple of days the U.S. Threatening to reveal strong evidence of Chinese involvement in providing military support to Russia as it wages this horrific war in Ukraine. So, we're at a dangerous point, and it's a point that I think we must address in a fashion that is consistent with the diagnosis of this dysfunctional, codependent relationship conflict. The bulk of the book draws out my view that the conflict has been prosecuted, unfortunately, on the basis of a number of false narratives that both nations have with respect to the other. We are prone to these false narratives because they mask some of our own vulnerabilities, and we'd rather blame others than face up to our problems. What do I mean by that? There's countless examples and chapters in the book that go into detail, but let me just briefly highlight two. One of them is America's false narrative that we have a trade deficit that is China's fault. And we've taken strong actions to demonstrate our resolve in that regard. But the way I do economics is trade deficits do not appear out of thin air. They're an outgrowth of a shortfall of domestic savings. Our domestic savings rate is lower than any leading nation has ever had. So we import surplus savings from abroad to fund our investment in economic growth. We run a big balance of payments deficit and a multilateral trade deficits last year with 106 nations. We blame China for that. It is our fault that we don't save as much. That's why it's a false narrative. Similarly, China has struggled to deal with many of the structural problems in its economy, especially I highlight in the book the failed consumer-led rebalancing of China. They've made a lot of progress, but they haven't made enough progress. And yet they increasingly blame that on America's efforts to contain China's rise. China certainly has reasons to worry about a U.S. containment strategy, but that has nothing to do with China's own inability to rebalance its economy. That's China's problem that cannot be blamed on the United States. So these false narratives are the high-octane fuel of conflict escalation. And, as I described just the events of the last 5 years, let alone the last couple of weeks, that high-octane fuel is easily combustible. A spark could set it off. There are plenty of sparks that are out there right now. We dodged the balloon spark, at least we think, but I worry about Taiwan, South China Sea, and China's role in the partnership with Russia in fighting the war in Ukraine. Let me just conclude, though, with a brief description of the ending of the book. Most authors, you're advised not to tell the ending because then your readers will not read the book. But I just want to summarize, at least tantalize you with what that ending is so that you will read the book. My diagnosis of a relationship problem requires me to come up with a relationship solution. And I offer 3 points in that regard that are detailed in the final part of the book. One, most obvious to everyone, is rebuilding trust. There is no trust between the United States and China. So I offer some low-hanging fruit, like reopening closed consulates in both countries, relaxing restrictions on the issuance of visas, restarting very popular and successful foreign exchange programs. Tougher to do would be relaxing pressures on non-governmental organizations or NGOs in both countries. And then big mega issues that both countries must attack that they have great mutual interest in resolving, like climate change, global health, and cybersecurity. And the final leg to my stool is prescribing a new organization to really revamp the architecture of engagement between the United States and China. I don't like the interactions to take place infrequently or serendipitously on a leader-to-leader basis, or even the old strategic and economic dialogues that I know you've been involved with, Craig, over the years, as I was too. We can do better, and I prescribe a detailed structure for a U.S.-China Secretariat, an organization equally staffed by American and Chinese professionals located in a neutral venue that has broad remit to cover all aspects of the relationship, from economics and trade to innovation and technology, subsidies of state-sponsored activities, the big mega issues like climate, health, cyber, and even human rights. And I'm hopeful that a secretariat focused on collaborative research can make a big difference in providing an ongoing, my timer's going off, sorry, I'm almost done, can provide an ongoing framework of engagement that will allow us to preemptively address issues of conflict before they get out of control. And the Secretary would also have the convening power to bring in experts from around the world to deal with tough problems, COVID being a classic example. And finally, the Secretary would have the function of monitoring existing and new agreements and would have the capacity for a dispute resolution mechanism. And in looking at my stopwatch, I realized I left out the second leg of the stool, which is focusing on completing negotiations on a bilateral investment treaty, much more of a pro-growth opportunity to lower investment barriers than subscribing to a framework that created deals that never worked, like the notorious Phase One trade accord. So that's my overview, Craig, and I welcome the
Terrific.
questions from you or the audience.
Terrific. And again, we do welcome questions from the audience. We will preference them, but I have a good number of questions that I'd like to pose. You note that at the heart of the problem in this dysfunctional relationship, there's a mismatch in savings. I fully subscribe to that agreement. Is the problem on the US side, that is insufficient savings, or on the Chinese side, excessive savings? And do you look at the fundamental source of this problem as do you see a pathway towards a better equilibrium?
Well, savings is a critical issue for both nations and for both economies. We save too little, China saves too much. And the way I look at savings is I look at national savings, which is the combined savings of individuals, businesses, and the government sector. And I strip out the depreciation that goes to replace the wear and tear of our capital stock. And so I look at a net domestic or national savings rate, and it's down to around 1% of the national income right now, which is pathetically low. And so lacking in that savings, we don't have enough wherewithal to fund our needed investments in infrastructure, human capital, and rebuilding the manufacturing sector that so many are focused on right now. So we borrow that from countries like China, Japan, and Canada. Part of that saving shortfall reflects our preference, of course, for unusually high levels of consumption as a share of our economy. And a lot of that, I have argued in this book and elsewhere, reflects the fact that we have consumed out of asset bubbles, which is not a sustainable trajectory for any nation. So we've got to boost our national savings primarily through addressing our long-term budget deficit problem, which we have not done. And we've gotten away with it for years because we've kept interest rates at unsustainably low levels. And that, of course, is now changing. China saves too much, and it creates, a condition of balance of payments and trade surpluses, which get China into trouble with the rest of the world, especially the United States. China's surplus savings, though, is a very visible manifestation of the fact that its consumers, out of fear of an uncertain financial future and a very porous social safety net, have a strong preference for high levels of fear-driven precautionary savings. This is not Chinese DNA. It's just a normal reaction to the uncertainty that they face in the future. And, I've urged the Chinese to focus their policies much more on building and funding a much more secure social safety net. So, and that has not happened. And recently there have been some actions taken by Chinese authorities on the health insurance, which are very disconcerting along those lines. If China saved less, it would consume more, and the consumer-led rebalancing, which has not been completed, would have a much better chance of playing out as China needs to do.
Yeah, I think that the Chinese government knows that they have this problem, but they haven't taken the steps necessary to really give consumers confidence. Let's turn to your second chapter on global value chains, or effectively what we're talking about is decoupling. and you take a good economist lens to this issue. And I'd be grateful if you could share your thoughts.
Well, cross-border trade, of course, is not what it used to be. Used to in the old simple days, you would build a good in one nation and export the finished product to your trading partners. And beginning really in the 1990s, through the advent of breakthroughs in logistics, sharp reductions in transportation costs, and advances in modern technology, that process really changed dramatically, so that cross-border trade represented the assembly of components and goods that were made in many, many countries, in some cases all over the world, and then shipped out to customers around the world. Our trade statistics do not effectively capture that. The iPhone is a classic case in point. When it leaves China, the full value of the iPhone as it's shipped to the United States is credited as an export from China, when in fact, it used to be only about 4% of the value added was made in China. And now I've now seen numbers that might increase that to as high as 20%, but that still suggests that the bulk of the value added comes elsewhere. And yet, that plays an important role in distorting the trade imbalances between our countries. So we need to update that. And, the debate on decoupling that you alluded to sort of very patriotically says no to supply chains, that we want to bring supply chains back home. Good luck with that. It's very difficult to do. These supply chains have taken a long time to construct. Again, Apple would be a case in point, the most value chain or supply chain intensive and successful company in the United States. They've just started to move some of their assembly and production from Guangdong province to India, but the progress is very slow, and there are reasons to raise questions as to how far they're going to get with that. Again, I go back to the point I made on savings and balances. We talk the talk of bringing manufacturing back home, but if we don't save more, then we're still going to be stuck with the need to import surplus savings from abroad, and that keeps the pressure on lots of countries to provide us with capital and exports that would keep our trade deficit very large.
So, Steve, as I noted, preference questions coming in from the audience, and we have two on your proposal for the Secretariat that has elicited a lot of interest. And one question is, how has it been received by the U.S. government or the Chinese government? And could you flesh out a little bit on how it would work in such a politicized environment? I think both good questions.
Yeah, those are terrific questions. I have presented my three-part plan, trust, the bilateral investment treaty, and the Secretariat to groups on both sides of the relationship. I was in Hong Kong last month and made a number of presentations to Hong Kong academics, business people, officials, and the like. They had a few quibbles with some adjustments they might make in the proposal that I detail in the final chapter of my book, but they generally were in favor of an organization whose tasked to deal with these thorny problems on a full-time basis, recognizing that it's very difficult to always be behind the curve and forced to staff up when a problem arises. I've made, and I just finished that point, I have not really presented the idea formally in China because I haven't been to China in a little over 3 years. I have presented this idea to a number of my Chinese contacts, colleagues, and friends, and their reaction is pretty much like the one I described in Hong Kong. A good starting point, and something we're interested in, but we would want to make a few tweaks. I have presented the same idea in this country, and while there's some interest in the private sector, there is zero interest in the public sector. The standard response from the public sector, the executive branch, and the Congress is something like, "You've got to be kidding. We're not interested in a framework of engagement with our adversary," and that is very disturbing to me. And I think while the proposal may not be perfect, the idea that the United States is so convinced that it's on the right side of this conflict that it has no interest in engaging the Chinese on a deeper and continual relationship is something I find very disturbing, and I'm determined to keep pushing this because I want to get decision makers in our public sector to begin thinking about a new framework of engagement before it's too late. And I worry that we're getting very close to that point where it sort of feels like it did. I was alive then, but I was not consciously aware of these things, but how it must have felt in the early 1950s.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. In your book, you've done something that I've never seen done before, and I think you do it very well, and that is to compare and contrast the American dream and the China dream. And so I wonder if you could share your thoughts there verbally, because this is really useful.
Well, thanks, Craig. It flows from the work I did on trying to draw these two nations collectively together from a narrative perspective. I think that the narrative is often overlooked in shaping national values, aspirations, and when it goes wrong in promoting conflict. So let's start with the American dream, which was written about by an author in the depths of the Depression, James Truslow Adams, who at a moment of great national despair said, all is not lost. America dreams of a better land, greater equality, a time to focus on quality over quantity of economic growth, and aspirational advances in living standards from generation to generation, to make that view. And it was picked up on by many presidents after the end of the Depression and World War II, especially Ronald Reagan. That view became very much embedded in our the political compact that our elected leaders have forged with the American people. And should anything be judged in violation of the American dream, that was a source of great concern that was deserving of political action. The Chinese dream is much newer. China's obviously a much older society and nation, but the Chinese dream was first espoused by Xi Jinping shortly after he assumed party leadership in November of 2012. And it was a dream that was very nationalistic, immediately very popular, focused on rejuvenating the Chinese economy back to its former state as being the dominant system in the world, and never again allowing China to suffer the indignities that it did during the so-called century of humiliation that started with the Opium Wars in the mid-1900s. Not by accident, Xi Jinping first articulated the Chinese dream at the National Museum of China in Tiananmen Square after he had just completed his first viewing of the rejuvenation exhibit, which took up the half of the first floor of the largest museum in the world. And, you know, this has been sort of his mantra to appeal to the Chinese people. And should anyone threaten that dream, then many of the actions that he's taking, especially with respect to the United States, should be justified as threatening that dream. And, you know, the legitimacy of many of his policies he continues to justify on the basis of the Chinese dream.
So one part of the Chinese dream that is clearly central to the dispute is technology. That Xi Jinping made indigenous innovation a major theme of the party Congress, and we have a technology dispute between the two countries. And you argue that the savings rate actually has pretty profound effect on technology development. I wonder if you could explore that with us, please.
Well, we certainly do have a huge dispute over technology, and I address that head on in the book, Craig. And you know, there, like so many of these false narratives, there is a certain element of fact that lies at the basis of the concerns, but I judge them to be false narratives because the facts then get distorted in creating actions against our so-called adversary. And so, you know, I take the poster child of the sort of the initiation of the trade dispute that prompted the tariffs in 2018, forced technology transfer. And I spend a lot of time talking about that. And I look at the Section 301 report that was written by U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer that pounds the table on this egregious transgression by the Chinese of forcing U.S. multinationals, many of whom are on this call right now, to set up joint ventures in China if they want to do business in China. And then they are coerced into turning over the crown jewels of their competitive prowess as grounded in technological advancement. And I'm not dismissive of the allegation, but I think that the evidence of that is extraordinarily weak. On page 19 of the Section 301 report written by Robert Lighthizer, he admits in black and white that there is no evidence that the technology transfer has been forced. When you set up a joint venture, of course, you share technologies and you share systems and personnel and strategies, but the allegation is one of coercion or forcing. And he says there's no evidence of that. And what he does is he relies on surveys that your organization and others have conducted over the years that talk about some difficulties in the area of technology, but do not necessarily come to the conclusion that the forcing mechanism is something that is the sin that it has been dubbed, that it justifies the tariffs that have since been imposed. And so I go on and on about this a lot. And every country has the right and the need to develop its own technology to promote economic growth. We do that, and China is no exception. And the U.S. In recent months, though, has really upped the ante big time on this by imposing draconian export sanctions on Chinese access to advanced semiconductors, which go right to the heart of their most important initiatives in innovation, indigenous innovation, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. And in doing that, we have basically admitted our national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, has led the charge in this, that we are, in fact, trying to constrain China's emergence as a strong competitive power, drawing its economic and technological strength on the basis of this technology dispute, and that continues to be ongoing. China plays a role in this. There's no question about it, through its dual use of technology for civilian and military purposes. We do that too, by the way, and it's always very difficult to disentangle the civilian and military applications of technology. The Chinese certainly can do a better job of being more transparent in describing the civilian applications that we should certainly encourage and recognize that their contributions to many of these areas are equally important to us in developing our own prowess in quantum computing, artificial intelligence,
Absolutely.
life sciences, and the like.
That's terrific, Steve. Since you were on Wall Street, I've always considered you one of the finest minds in international finance. And in your book, you talk about the weaponizing of the dollar and the exorbitant privilege that the U.S. Holds. We see that being whittled away, but I'd be grateful for your reflections on that. The sanctions that you mentioned, the development of the central bank currencies in China, the move by the Chinese to SIPs away from SWIFT. You know that you're in academia, you can speak freely on this, and I'd be grateful for your thoughts.
Well, it's a very contentious issue, but I have from time to time offered to forecast the ups and downs of the dollar. I should have known better. I think that's about the toughest thing there is to forecast. Alan Greenspan once counseled me and others that any forecast of the dollar is no better than a coin toss. And of course, he was entirely right. But I think it's, the idea that the dollar is going to lose its role as the world's reserve currency. We've debated that. And there have been other examples of leading countries where that has happened. Great Britain, of course, is the most recent dominant currency that has lost its role as the world's reserve currency. Could it happen to us? It could, as the world gets more developed and other countries move to relax their controls on the free flow of international capital. They manage their international imbalances effectively. There's every reason to believe that the days of one single dominant reserve currency could eventually come to an end. Will it happen in a short period of time for the United States? I don't think so. Having said that, though, Craig, the one move that is really raised a number of eyebrows around the world came with some of the first round of sanctions that the United States imposed on Russia, freezing a large chunk of Russia's assets, several $100 billion that were held in the form of U.S. treasuries. And that is an area that it really has not been entertained in the world of cross-border sanctions before. And that is an example of weaponizing currency reserves that I think has a lot of people concerned about what this means in the future. And I would say, I'm nervous about that one when it comes to our second largest holder by a thin margin of currency reserves, which is China. And the idea that China is now providing lethal support to Russian military operations in Ukraine, it's quite possible that there is a discussion going on right now as to what types of sanctions should the United States impose on China if, in fact, we do have hard evidence, as many are now alluding to in the U.S. government. And I just saw overnight that the warning of those sanctions did not just come from the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, but it also came from the Secretary of Treasury, Janet Yellen, who has a lot to say about financial sanctions should they be imposed on any nation. She had a lot to say about their imposition on Russia, and she could have something to say about the types of sanctions that might be directed at China should this evidence be verified.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you, Steve. One of the parts of the book that I enjoyed the most was your discussion on the socialist market economy. And you noted, I thought really insightfully, that hybrid models are full of inconsistencies. And I think that you noted also that the Chinese financial regulatory system is a facsimile of the US or British, imposed on a state-owned or at least mostly state-owned financial institutions. And you note the problems associated with that. And I thought that that was really excellent and useful as we think forward and as Chinese economic planners think forward. So I think we'll wonder if you could expand on that, please.
Yeah, I've been a real optimist on China for a long time, Craig. I mean, I've been focusing on China in depth, initially from the Morgan Stanley perch, and then through my work at Yale over the last 13, 14 years. And throughout most of that period, I've been very upbeat about the prospects of the Chinese economy. But, no economy is without problems. And the one that I focused on a lot over the years that I felt needed to be very high on the agenda for China was state-owned enterprise reform. And I certainly was not alone in that regard. And I think this has been a big missing link. And what worries me about the current state of play in state-owned enterprise reform is, number one, under Xi Jinping, the SOEs now have much more power in shaping and driving the economy than they used to. The pendulum has swung from a growth dynamic that was driven in large part by a rapidly expanding entrepreneurial private sector to one where the pendulum of economic support has shifted back to these ossified, low return and low productivity state-owned enterprises. And I argued that this is worrisome, and it almost has Japanese-like characteristics because of some actions that were taken early on in the Xi Jinping administration, focusing on this model of mixed ownership state-owned enterprise reforms, which to me resembled the financial engineering of the Japanese keiretsus, where they ended up supporting each other by buying their own share prices. In Japan, of course, this was a recipe for disaster because the stock market formed a massive bubble that then burst and dragged all these cross holdings and their keiretsus underwater and created a generation of zombies that Japan is still trying to grapple with. And so I looked at the Japanese case very carefully, and I worried that China, if it did not address its state-owned enterprise problem, could find itself in a comparable quagmire. I was not alone in that. And in fact, there were some leading Chinese officials who were very sympathetic to that. I taught a course for a dozen years at Yale called The Lessons of Japan, where I went through this phenomenon in great detail, and I was brought over to China a number of times to give a short version of the seminar, the course, to Chinese academics and officials. And in May of 2016, there was a very famous interview published on the front pages of People's Daily with a so-called anonymous authoritative person that raised many of these questions about SOE reform and China's tendency to take on Japanese keiretsu-like characteristics, especially based on this voracious appetite of debt. So it's a big issue. It has not been resolved. It remains a problem, and I think it plays into my concerns, which are now more problematic with respect to the Chinese economy than they've been at any point in my career, because I worry that it's not just state-owned enterprises that are dragging the productivity down of the overall economy, but it's some of the regulatory pressures bearing down on internet platform companies, which had been an important source of dynamism and explosive entrepreneurial activity in China over the last 15 years.
So, Steve, you quote a number of times in the book Wen Jiabao's comment from 2007 that China's economy is unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. Well, that quote comes from 15, 16 years ago. Is it still true today?
Yeah, I think it's a good, a fairly honest assessment of what was wrong with the sort of first phase of the Deng Xiaoping model. It was a hyper-growth model that was born out of necessity. China had just come out of two decades of social and political turmoil, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and they needed an antidote to deal with what might have been a failed economy. And so they relied on exports, investment, foreign direct investment, used their outsized saving to fund these investments, and also drew on the desire of the West, especially the United States, to embrace the opening of China and the related membership of China in the WTO in late 2001 to turbocharge this hyper growth economy. But what Wen Jiabao said in March of 2007, Craig, was, it's worked brilliantly, but it's not a sustainable solution because we have created this lopsided economy, too heavy on investment and exports and not enough internal private consumption. We've created the imbalances at that point. The trade surplus, the current account surplus was larger than any nation had ever experienced. And this created a number of contentious objections from the US and others about currency manipulation and mercantilism and the like. And then the sustainability issues were very, very serious in terms of the environmental degradation, air, water, and that it caused enormous consternation and actual protest from the Chinese people over that. So a new model was needed, and that really encouraged me that the government was willing to embrace a new approach that would rebalance and restructure the economy in a way that would be more sustainable, less unbalanced, and one that would improve the quality of economic growth rather than fixate simply on the expansion of the quantity. And that seemed to work. I drew enormous encouragement from the Wen Jiabao critique, became even more optimistic when others were leaning the other way. And then, it's been a setback in these last 10 years as the rebalancing agenda has not been completed as I'd hoped that would be the case.
Yeah, I concur. And as was mentioned in the party Congress, that reform and opening will continue, but I'd love to see some evidence of that and some bold moves to promote growth in the Chinese economy. And I'm sorry, I don't see it right now. So, Steve, let's look at go back to some of your recommendations. Your book is entitled "Accidental Conflict," and we want to avoid any conflict, especially accidental conflict. So, and you had a good number of recommendations. I'm not sure everybody knows about the Bilateral Investment Treaty, or the BIT. So perhaps you could share your thoughts on that, and how you think why you think that's a good approach to avoiding conflict.
Happy to do that, Craig. None of these recommendations that I have can be accomplished if we don't do the first thing on my list, which is focus on rebuilding trust. So we had negotiated a market opening bilateral investment treaty, the US and China, for over a decade. And, according to the USTR, who was finalizing these negotiations in the Obama administration, Mike Froman, we were about 95% of the way done in reaching agreement with China. And then Trump, of course, took that off the table, as he did to most of Obama's efforts in negotiating treaties with many, many countries, including Mexico and Canada. But there's been no attempt to restart negotiations on a BIT. I like a BIT because it focuses on opening up markets in both countries to the other. And so it's inherently pro-growth. To do that, though, BITs typically negotiate a lot on many contentious structural issues that divide trading partners. And I looked at a huge number of BITs that the United States had negotiated over the years, and saw that the arbitrage over what they called side issues was just as important in many respects as it was in lowering overall investment barriers. There's this notion of the restricted list of sectors that most BITs emphasize, areas that are verboten to market opening for national security purposes or other reasons. That's also a negotiable item. But that has not prevented China from signing over 100 BITs, or for the US having over 45 of them currently in place. And so I strongly urge that rather than go back to this phase one type framework, which was an utter failure in terms of what it accomplished in fixing America's trade problem, that's the wrong recipe. That a much better recipe would be to really focus on the market opening opportunities that can come from allowing each of us to have access to our large and growing markets. And I think this is a far more robust recommendation that is pro-growth than the types of trade deals which are zero-sum, and you could argue in many cases would inhibit economic growth.
Yeah, that's excellent, Steve. Thank you. I appreciate your formulation that we have a dysfunctional relationship here based on false narratives, kind of predicated on savings or savings mismatch. And I think that that's a really useful way to frame the relationship. And it points the way forward in the relationship. We need to be honest about these economic imbalances, and we need to both sides address our economic imbalances. And we both need both sides need to honestly open up with each other to build trust. So I hope that if a secretariat is named, that you're at the head of it, or at least one of the senior members. I do think that your book contributes significantly to addressing the problems within the relationship. I hope it's very well read, and I hope that we'll be able to talk with you again in the near future as we continue to try to manage our businesses in an environment that's fraught with uncertainty, threat, and a lower level of inherent growth. So Steve, Roach, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for a wonderful piece of scholarship. I hope everybody reads it. Let me wish you a good day, and everyone who is on has stayed with us throughout this discussion. Thank you very much, and thank you for your questions that have been brought up over the course of the discussion. So with that, let us adjourn, and I wish everyone a great day. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you very much.
Let's be in touch.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.